In this video, we're going to review some of the basic concepts of authentication and authorization. The difference between them is that authentication is where we verify the identity of a user who wants to access a resource that we're making available. And so we're really answering the question, who are you? Whereas authorization is the process of determining an authenticated user's permission to access a requested resource. In other words, having answered the question, who are you? We're then asking the question, are you allowed to access the resource that you're requesting to access? Now, there are many approaches to authentication, and some of the more common approaches are shown here. Password-based authentication is one that most people are extremely familiar with, but it has been shown that password-based authentication on its own is becoming less and less reliable these days. Multifactor authentication is where multiple approaches to authentication are used together. So with password-based authentication, we ask the user to provide an identifier. This will be unique to that user, often called a username. Sometimes we might ask for an email instead, and a password. And so the server will retrieve the user record from storage based upon that unique user ID and then compare the user's password with the one that was stored and has just been retrieved. And if they are the same, we assume that the user who is logging in is the actual user that they claim to be. There are problems with this, mainly surrounding the concept of security attacks. Multi-factor authentication will use two or more independent ways to verify a user. For example, user ID and password, followed by one or more of some things like sending codes to smartphone or email, using fingerprints or other biometric recognition. But there are problems with that as well, because what happens if a person loses their phone and cannot access these secondary factors of authentication? Certificate-based authentication is where a certification authority issues a digital certificate to a given user, and that certificate is used when authenticating the user. So the third-party certification authority will be contacted by the server to verify the credibility of the certificate that is being sent by the user who is trying to gain access. With biometric authentication, the system relies on unique biological characteristics of an individual. So if the person who is logging in can provide biometric specimens, such as facial image or fingerprint specimen and so on, then we are confident that the user who is trying to gain access is indeed the person they claim to be. With token-based authentication, the user will first gain access through successful authentication and will then be given a unique encrypted string of random characters, and this is the token. The server will provide that token, and for subsequent accesses, the user will use that token instead of having to authenticate again. And what the server will do is to verify that the token is correct before granting access. Having authenticated the user, we then need to authorize each request. It's quite common to do this. If you happen to be a registered customer for a supermarket, you know that you can order delivery of products, maybe a litre of milk. But you also know that you cannot set the price of that litre of milk because you don't have the permission to do so. And that's a very good example of the difference between permissions. And authorization is the process whereby the server determines whether a user is permitted to access a requested resource. And there are three common approaches to authorization: role-based, device, and location. Role-based is probably the most common. What an enterprise will do is to identify groups of users based on business roles, and each role will be allocated a set of resources that they are permitted to access. So when a user is authenticated, the server is able to identify the role of that user because that role is stored with the user record. And then the server can grant access to certain resources within the enterprise based upon that authenticated user's roles. With device-based authorization, it is the device itself which has a unique identifier, typically the MAC address, that will identify the device. That device is registered with the server, and then the server will grant permission based on whether that device is trusted. So if a user accesses the system with a trusted device, then permissions will be granted to certain resources and not to others. With location-based authorization, permissions are granted based upon where the access to the system is taking place. For example, if the access is done from within the premises of that enterprise, then full access could be granted. But if the user is trying to access those same resources from off the premises, access might actually be limited. For example, we don't want necessarily to send sensitive data to a user's device if that device is on a train, because it is feasible that the user might accidentally forget to take that device from the train when disembarking, and that would leave the sensitive data available to anybody who happens to pick up the device. Now, I've only touched very briefly upon the topics of authentication and authorization, so you would need to do some more background reading to get a much better understanding of these topics.